we've had a number of questions about Labour's plans to introduce a digital ID system across the UK. So we're going to whip through them all. Keir Starmer said it will make borders more secure, but our listeners had a lot more questions on the subject. One of them was, how will Labour's digital ID system work for people who don't have smartphones? And another related question was, my grandmother struggles to use her smartphone and gets confused by which app is which. How will the new ID card plans cater for people like her? And lastly, anyone who has ever sought employment or to let a flat in Britain will know it's difficult to credit the government's stated pretext for national ID cards, namely that it will reduce immigration, not least because anti-immigration measures are already so thoroughly embedded into routine administrative procedures. What's the real reason why people in charge of Labour care about this so much? So let's take this idea of, what about people who could only really use them if they were physical cards first? Rachel, is this something you've been considering?
Yeah, well, the first thing I want to say is these are all really great questions, and I think they're very representative of how the British public are feeling about this. There's a lot of confusion, a lot of uncertainty. And the way this was announced on the Friday before Labour Party conference as part of a sort of wider immigration, populism, patriotism speech didn't give any of the details. So I'm not surprised people are confused. The details of this policy, or the details of the thinking behind the policy, come from a report by Labour Together, the think tank that we've all heard so much about, that they published in June, that was looking at how digital ID cards could solve not just the illegal immigration challenge, but all kinds of other things as well. And some of the answers to these questions are in that report, although they haven't been communicated at all by the government. To start off with, on the smartphone question, I went on the gov.uk website and they actually have a sort of answer to this, which is, what will you do about digital inclusion?
Yes.
And the answer is they're going to have a consultation about it. And they are thinking very carefully. They are aware that not everyone has a smartphone. They're aware that not everyone is tech savvy. There will be a consultation about alternatives. One possibility is that people will get a physical card if they want to opt into that, as opposed to having it on their phones. One option, sort of a way of thinking about it, is it's less a card and it's more a big digital centralised government database. And if you're registered appropriately on the system, whether you have the app or you have the card or not, somebody can check
that you're on there,
look you up. So it's kind of more of a
So it's a bit like when you go to hospital, you don't really need your NHS number because they have details about you on their system without the number, kind of thing.
Yeah, but the number is the kind of thing that links you to the database. Although one of the things this is meant to do is join up your NHS number, your passport number, your driving licence number, your tax number, your national insurance number, like all of those things.
Which brings us nicely on to that next question about, what's the real reason for this measure? Because actually I've been speaking to people at Labour conference who know a lot about policy who have said that the worst argument for national ID cards is the reducing illegal immigration one. It's actually far more useful in terms of a joined up state.
Yeah. And I think this question about, well, hang on, employers already have to do these right to work checks is a really valid one. Again, looking at the Labour Together report, they would argue that yes, employers do have to do these checks, but the way they do these checks is sometimes very costly to them. They have to use third-party providers. They ask people to prove their identity. Like if you've got a passport, that's great. Not everyone has a passport. If you don't, you have to find some other way of proving your identity. So this, they argue, would actually be helpful in terms of sort of levelling the playing field. Everyone has one proof of identity that they can show. The other thing it would do is it would just enable the Home Office to get better at enforcement, because rather than having to look at every employer separately and go, have you all done your checks? Are you all compliant with this? They'd have a centralised database that they can match up with things like PAYE and other tax data, so they could see, like, has this check been done? So that's what they argue it would do. And they also point out that it is, even though these checks are mandatory, it's relatively easy for somebody working in the grey economy to provide a piece of proof of identity from somebody else and get in under the radar. So they have looked at this. One thing as well about the question about my grandmother struggles for this, at the moment, the plan is just to use this in terms of right to work. Now, I'm assuming this person's grandmother who's struggling to use her smartphone possibly isn't going to be doing a right to work check anytime soon. So the thing about we want to do it by the end of the Parliament, that's specifically on working. The wider arguments that you could use it for NHS and your pension and your tax and like everything else, that is a potential that could come later. But I agree with you. I think there are arguments for doing this, and the arguments for doing this are about a better, more efficient, joined up state that is easier for citizens and people engaging with the state to use and get the services that they want to. That's the argument for it, not we're going to put extra burdens on you to try and tackle illegal immigration.
Yeah. And we had another question on digital ID as well. Does the government really think it's a good idea to make people in Northern Ireland carry around something called a BRIC card? So this is the name given to these cards in that Labour Together report that you mentioned. Douglas Alexander, the Scotland Secretary, has since come out and said they're not going to be called BRIC cards and they're not even a card at all. Where did this come from, and is it part of the branding?
Well, it came from the Labour Together report, but I think what that shows is that the people who were involved in briefing this policy last week hadn't really thought too hard about it, because of course that's going to be an issue of contention. I think that it's a relatively easy one to fix. You just call it something else. But I do think it's interesting that all 5 of the main parties in Northern Ireland have come out against this, and they have said it's not because we're upset about it being called a BRIC card, but actually it has implications for people living and working in Northern Ireland that it doesn't have for the rest of the UK, because of the Good Friday Agreement, because of the fact that people anywhere on the island of Ireland can cross that border and work and live, and how's all that going to work? And we don't have an answer on any of that. So it's a valid thing to have noted, and it's a sort of valid thing to criticise the government comms department on for not thinking about it. And there are some wider questions there. So again, really good questions.
From Brexit to digital ID cards, they always forget about Northern Ireland, it seems.
I also think it's interesting that ID cards are making a comeback when that was such a Tony Blair era flagship New Labour policy. It feels like Tony Blair is coming back in all kinds of areas at the moment. What do you think he'd make of this?
Well, this is one of the Tony Blair Institute's policies, isn't it? It's something that they've been pushing. And we spoke on a recent episode of the podcast about America and sort of the influence of big tech on British politics, and the Tony Blair Institute seems to be one of the handmaidens of that. So it's interesting in terms of what influences the government has, and Tony Blair is very much still enmeshed in British political life and policy making, which leads to, I think, some of the backlash as well. We've seen, obviously, since Brexit, before Brexit, over the past couple of decades, a backlash towards globalization and its manifestation in people's day-to-day lives. And I saw a lot of this opposition to digital ID at the Labour conference. I think the most interesting conversation that I had at conference didn't take place at all in the actual conference centre, but was probably with my Uber driver on the way home. I know it's a cliche for journalists to quote their cab drivers when they venture out of London. But he said, he was giving his views on the cost of living and sort of sounded very sort of middle of the road and moderate in terms of his views on politics. But then he said, what about this digital ID? Are they actually going to do it? And I said, well, they've announced it. It looks like one of their plans. And he said, well, it won't be long till we move on to China's social credit system. And, you will be ranked on how well and badly you behave. And there were people jaywalking, crossing the road on a red man. And he said, if they're doing that now, they'd have points taken off them and they'd find it harder to get a mortgage or to, get a rental because their social credit would have gone down on these cards. And so I thought that was interesting because this guy wasn't a classic conspiracy theorist type. He didn't, mind either way about Keir Starmer's leadership or anything like that. But I think what's happening is these kind of policies come out and people are already feeling disconnected, suspicious of institutions, tired of everyone being on their phones. You saw, a big part of the riots that took place after Southport. Apparently a big part of that, according to the research that's been done since, is a feeling of disconnection in society that goes beyond a feeling that you don't know your neighbours because of their race or their ethnic background. And part of that is, and I've heard it in focus groups myself, is everyone being on their phones and, not communicating with each other in the way that they used to. And I think it's almost part of this backlash towards a more digitalised, atomised state. And I think that's going to be really difficult for Labour to counter.
That's fascinating. It's like it's out of step with one of the things that the public feel is a real challenge.
Yeah.
I think that is really interesting. I think the polling on it more generally it also kind of tells a story. So in the Labour Together report, they say our polling suggests that 80% of people support this. More in Common tested this again after Starmer's announcement, and they found that net support had fallen from plus 35% to minus 14. So, there is a Starmer effect here. Just the fact that he's announcing it, people immediately go, oh, it's not for the right reasons. Oh, it's not going to work. Oh, they're doing this because they think it's going to tackle migration. It's not. It's only going to lead to dystopian surveillance state or whatever. So I think the government has to be a bit cautious of that as well.